I never thought I'd be telling this story, but then again, I never thought I'd live a life like this. My name is Nicole. I'm 62 years old and I live in Beverly Hills. Sounds glamorous. Doesn't it? A big house, a wealthy husband, expensive wine and designer clothes? On the outside, it's perfect. But inside, I'm suffocating. My husband Richard is a man of old habits. He's grumpy, set in his ways, and worst of all, he hasn't touched me properly in years. He barely looks at me anymore, except when he complains about how much I spend or how the house is run and me. I am still very much a woman. I feel desire, heat, a hunger that refuses to fade with age. But my body, my needs, they mean nothing to him. My children left for London years ago to study, and I stayed behind with a man who barely notices whether I'm home or not. I've had my fair share of secrets affairs here and there, little indulgences to keep myself sane. But what happened that day? That was something else. Something primal. Something unforgettable. It all started when I decided to have the pool cleaned. It was a hot, golden afternoon, the kind where the California sun drapes itself over you like a slow, lazy lover. I called a new service, just a random number from an online search. I had no idea what was about to walk through my gates, and then he arrived, a god of a man. He stepped onto my property like he owned it, a confident stride, muscles flexing under the scorching sun, his skin black as polished obsidian, shining like bronze under the heat, was pure taut perfection. His shoulders broad as the ocean, his arms thick and veined, pulsing with raw strength. Every move he made was effortless, exuding a dominance that sent a sharp thrill straight between my thighs. I was speechless, and then he looked at me, his eyes dark, deep consuming. They weren't just looking at me. They were devouring me as if he could see right through my silk robe and feel the heat pooling between my legs. He didn't smirk, didn't flirt, didn't need to. That gaze alone was a promise. A silent declaration that he was a man who never begged, and God help me. I wanted to offer myself to him without a single word. Then he spoke, his voice like a low, deep growl, dripping with an intoxicating richness. I'm Kali here for the pool. I nearly whimpered. His name slithered through my mind like a forbidden spell, something dark, dangerous, and irresistible. Caliph. I watched him as he worked. I was hypnotized by the way his muscles tensed and relaxed with each movement, the way the sweat gathered on his thick neck and slid down his back. He was dripping, glistening, his chest so broad, so carved I could almost taste him. I took a slow sip of whiskey, my throat dry, my pulse frantic. I knew what was happening inside me. I was aching for him and he knew it. I should have looked away. I should have feigned disinterest, pretended to be nothing more than a bored housewife, casually observing the hired help. But I couldn't. Kali held my gaze, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a confidence so unshakable. It sent a shiver through my body, a heat coiled in my stomach, spreading lower, tightening. I took another sip of whiskey, my lips wrapping around the glass, my tongue flicking against the rim just to see if he noticed. He did a slow-kin. Knowinging smirk curled at the corner of his full lips. He didn't have to flirt. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who existed beyond effort. Women simply fell at his feet, drawn in by his effortless dominance, his sheer presence. And in that moment, I knew I was no different. I watched him work, mesmerized by the way his muscles flexed with every movement. His back was broad, his shoulders sculpted with such perfection. It was almost artistic. Sweat glistened on his dark skin, rolling in tantalizing paths down, his spine disappearing into the waistband of his low-slung shorts. I imagined running my tongue along that glistening trail. My pulse pounded at the thought. By the time he finished, I was barely holding myself together. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his biceps flexing, and turned toward me. All done, he said, his voice, that deep, rich bass that vibrated in my bones. I reached for my purse, pulling out my wallet. My hands trembled slightly as I counted out the bills, and without thinking I handed him double what he was owed, his brows lifted slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's too much," he said. I should have just smiled and told him to keep it. I should have left it at that, but the whiskey, the heat, the need inside me took over. Instead of answering, I reached out my fingers, grazing his bare chest, feeling the firm, heated muscle beneath my touch. A slow stroke, deliberate tracing along the sweat, dampened skin. Collie didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply watched me. The air between us grew thick, heavy with something electric, something undeniable. My breath came unsteady as I looked up at him, my fingers still trailing along his body. Maybe, I murmured, "There's something else you could do to earn it for the first time." He hesitated, not out of shyness. No men like Collie didn't experience things like that. It was something else, a calculation, a decision being made, in that precise moment. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and then, just like that, his hesitation vanished. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, thick with heat. I exhaled shakily, feeling the last of my restraint shatter into dust. I didn't just want this. I needed it. "Yes," I whispered. I took his hand, large, strong, callous, and led him inside, not to the bedroom, not to the couch where my husband lay still fast asleep. No. I took him to the garage and I let go. The garage smelled of old leather and polished metal, the lingering scent of motor oil mixing with the faint perfume on my skin. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the sleek black sports car that my husband cherished more than he cherished me. How fitting Collie followed me inside, his presence overwhelming, filling the space like a storm rolling in my pulse, pounded so hard I could hear it, a deep, steady drumbeat in my ears. I turned to face him. The air between us was thick, heavy, electric. I could barely breathe. He towered over me, his massive frame radiating heat. His shirt was still off, his glistening chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Every inch of him was sculpted, carved from pure power, from something untamed and raw. His dark skin gleamed under the dim lights, the ridges of his muscles casting shadows that made my mouth water. I was starving. Caliph's eyes dragged down my body, slowly taking his time the way he looked at me. It was unlike anything I had felt in years. Maybe ever there was no politeness, no hesitancy, just hunger, raw, pure, unapologetic hunger. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening turnaround. He ordered. A shiver ran down my spine. I obeyed. I felt his presence move closer, the warmth of his body radiating against my bare back. Then his hands' large, warm palms gliding down my arms. His presence was undeniable, strong, certain, commanding, without a word. He stepped closer, the warmth of his body radiating through the space between us. My breath hitched. "You've been thinking about this, haven't you?" He murmured against my ear, his voice low and deep, sending a shiver through me. I swallowed, hard heat rising to my cheeks. I nodded. "Say it," he said, his tone, leaving no room for hesitation. "Yes," I whispered louder. "Yes." I gasped, my voice barely stronger than a breath. I felt his quiet amusement, the edge of a smirk against my skin. Then, without warning, he lifted me effortlessly, placing me onto the cool hood of my husband's car. A sharp contrast, the cold beneath me, the warmth of him standing before me. Steady, unwavering, he leaned in his lips, capturing mine in a deep, slow kiss, one that sent my pulse. Racing, his hands traced my arms, my waist holding me in place with an undeniable presence. The world outside disappeared. The only thing that existed was the fire between us, the energy, the unspoken understanding for what felt like eternity. The garage was filled with soft gasps, quiet sighs, the rhythm of something inevitable, and just a few rooms away. My husband slept, soundly unaware, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through his home. By the time it was over, I was breathless, my heart still pounding, my thoughts. Hazy Caliph stood before me, steady as ever, his dark eyes unreadable, his breathing. Even as he reached for his shirt with a slow, practiced movement, he pulled it back over his head, smoothing the fabric down as if nothing had happened. He looked at me once, a silent glance that said everything. Then without a word he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving me there breathless, changed, and lost in the aftershock of what had just transpired. I had never felt anything like that before. It wasn't just the raw physicality of it. It wasn't just the way Kali had taken control. The way he had commanded me, owned me, wrecked me in ways I didn't even know were possible. It was the way I had let him. No, not let wanted, needed, begged. I had always thought of myself as a strong woman, independent, proud. But with Caliph with him, I had become something else entirely. Something wild, something desperate, something completely powerless under his touch, yet somehow more alive than I had ever been before. The weight of what I had done started to settle over me. My robe lay discarded on the garage floor, my lace lingerie in disarray, the expensive pearl necklace. My husband had bought me resting, crooked against my collarbone, a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living, a life I had just shattered. And yet I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little Kali had left without a word. He hadn't asked for my number, hadn't made any promises, hadn't even glanced back as he walked out the door, and I had just let him go. Because I knew that was the only way it could have been. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about something sweet or romantic or lasting. This was a moment, a fire that had burned fast, hot, uncontrollable, and then disappeared into the night, leaving behind only smoke and ashes. And I would never see him again. I slid off the hood of the car, my legs still weak, my body aching in ways that felt sinful. I grabbed my robe and wrapped it around me, pulling it tight as I made my way back inside. The house was silent, dimly lit. My husband was still in the living room, still asleep, his chest rising and falling in that slow, steady rhythm that had once brought me comfort, but now only felt like a dull reminder of everything I had lost with him. I stood there for a moment, watching him, wondering, would he wake up? Would he feel it somehow? Would he sense that the woman he had ignored for years had just been completely and utterly ravaged by another man in his own garage? Would he notice the way my skin still tinged, the way my breath still hitched at the memory? No, of course not, because he never noticed anything. That was why I had done it, not to hurt him, not even to betray him, but because I had spent years being invisible, being unloved, being untouched. And for one night, I had been seen. I walked past him without a word, without a glance, and disappeared into the bedroom. The scent of Caliph still lingered on my skin, on my lips, in the very air around me, and I didn't wash it away. Not that night. Maybe not ever. It's been 6 months since that night. 6 months since I let myself be consumed, taken, devoured. 6 months since I felt what it was like to be wanted with such raw, unfiltered need. And yet, I still think about him. Kaif, his name lingers in my mind, like the taste of forbidden fruit on my lips. I try to forget, but I can't. I try to push the memory away, but it's always there in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the house, when my husband is snoring in the other room, in the reflection I see in the mirror, when I slip out of my robe at night. I run my fingers over my own skin, remembering his touch. And it's never enough. I thought I could lock that night away, keep it as a secret, a one-time sin, a reckless indulgence that I could tuck into the folds of my past and never revisit. But I was wrong, so wrong, because that night awakened something in me, a hunger, a craving, a need that has only grown stronger with time, no matter how much I try to suppress it. I close my eyes and he's there, the way his dark, glistening skin felt beneath my fingertips, the way his muscles flexed as he moved over me, the way his hands gripped my hips, hard, possessive, as if I belonged to him in that moment, and the way I wanted to belong to him. My husband still hasn't noticed a thing. Not the way I've changed, not the way my body aches at night for something he could never give me. I feel like a ghost in my own home, walking through the motions, dressing in silk and diamonds, hosting charity glass and dinner parties, smiling on the outside, while I starve on the inside. I thought I could endure it. I thought one night would be enough. But it wasn't. I am starving, and I know exactly what I need. I reach into the drawer of my bedside table. My fingers hesitate for only a moment before they find what they're looking for. A single crumpled business card. His name, his number. I kept it. Of course I did. I was never strong enough to throw it away. My heart pounds as I trace my fingers over the digits, memorizing them, letting the temptation consume me all over again. I could call him. I shouldn't, but I could. The thought alone sends a rush of heat through me. Would he remember me? Would he still want me? Would he take me again? Just as fiercely? Just as mercilessly? Just as perfectly as before? I don't know. But I'm about to find out. My fingers tighten around the phone, and I dial. I press the phone to my ear, my pulse hammering my breath. Coming in shallow gasps, the line rings once, twice, 3 times, and then a deep, familiar voice rumbles through the speaker. Yeah. I close my eyes, my body already trembling with anticipation. Callie. I whisper a pause, then that voice, that smooth, confident, knowing voice. Well, he murmurs, and I can hear the smirk in his tone. Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again. Mrs. Montgomery. His voice alone sends a shiver down my spine. I swallow hard. I need you. Silence a beat, then a low, amused chuckle. Yeah, he says, his voice dark with certainty. I figured you would. I gripped the phone tighter, my heart racing. This is it. The moment of no return. I take a slow, shaky breath. My husband's out of town this weekend. Another pause. Then that same damn chuckle texts me the address. I exhale, my pulse pounding in my throat. I don't hesitate. I don't overthink. I don't let guilt creep in. I simply type the message and press. Send. I stare at the screen, waiting, burning, knowing. I've just set something dangerous in motion. Then the reply comes, one word, one promise on my way, and just like that, the fire starts.